The frontier held its breath as dusk crept across the land. Wind dragged fingers of dust along the trail, whispering over dry grass and broken stones. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled low and slow, like a warning the land itself was too tired to shout. The sky burned copper and bruised purple, the kind of sunset that promised a hard night ahead. He lay where the trail bent away from the hills, half in shadow, half in dying light. A cowboy, blood-soaked and unmoving, slumped beside his fallen horse. The animal's flank no longer rose. The man's chest barely did. Every breath rattled like it might be his last. One boot had slipped loose, his hat lost somewhere back along the road. Whoever had done this hadn't bothered to finish the job. Out here, they didn't need to. The land would take care of the rest. Flies circled the blood. The smell of iron mixed with dust and sweat. His eyes fluttered open once, unfocused, staring at nothing. A name slipped from his lips, too weak to carry. Then silence again. That was when they found him. The widow had come out with her children to gather firewood before night fell. Their cabin sat too far from town to risk darkness, without heat. The youngest child spotted the horse first and froze. The older one followed the line of the reins and saw the man. Fear struck fast and sharp. Strangers meant trouble. Wounded men meant worse. They had little enough already. The widow knelt beside him, her face tightening as she took in the blood, the torn coat, the shallow breathing. Helping him would cost them time, food, safety, maybe their lives. The children whispered, some in fear, one in protest, one in quiet hope. The wind carried the sound of thunder closer now. She hesitated, just for a moment. Then she tore a strip from her skirt and pressed it to the wound. "We can't leave him," she said, more to herself than to them. The frontier had taught her many lessons, but mercy was one she refused to forget. They dragged him off the trail as the light faded. Behind them, the road stayed empty. Ahead of them, a choice had been made, one that would change all of their lives, though none of them yet knew just how far the consequences would reach. They dragged him the last few yards through the dirt, the widow bracing his shoulders, while the children struggled with his boots and legs. He was heavier than he looked, all bone and muscle beneath blood-soaked cloth. By the time they reached the cabin door, night had crept in, cold and unforgiving, and the widow's arms trembled from more than exhaustion. Still, she pushed the door open and pulled him inside, into the only shelter they had left. The cabin was small, too small for mercy. A single room with rough-hewn walls, a thin table, 3 stools, and a bed that already belonged to the children. The fire was weak, barely alive, and the smell of boiled roots and old smoke hung heavy in the air. When they laid the cowboy down, the floorboards creaked as if protesting the weight of another mouth to feed. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, as though warning them of the cost. The children hovered close, each reacting in their own way. The youngest clung to the widow's skirt, eyes wide with fear, whispering that the man might die right there and bring trouble with him. The middle child knelt nearby, quiet and watchful, offering water when asked, eyes soft with concern. The eldest stood apart, jaw tight, anger burning hotter than the fire, angry that they had risked everything for a stranger when they already had nothing to spare. The widow worked in silence. She cut away bloodied fabric, cleaned wounds with boiled water gone lukewarm, and wrapped what she could with strips torn from her only spare sheet. Her hands were steady, but her thoughts were not. Every bandage used was one less for her children. Every moment spent tending him was a gamble against hunger tomorrow. She checked his breathing again and again, leaning close, listening for life. He did not wake. Not fully. Only murmured, fractured words slipping past cracked lips. Names she didn't recognize, places that sounded far beyond their reach. The children exchanged looks. This man did not sound like a drifter. He did not sound poor. As the fire burned lower, the cabin filled with a fragile, dangerous quiet. They shared the same air, the same fear, the same uncertain night. No one spoke of what would happen if he survived, or what would happen if he didn't. Out there on the frontier, mercy always came with a cost, and tonight, that cost slept on their floor. The days that followed moved slow, measured by the rise and fall of the injured man's breathing and the careful rationing of what little the cabin held. Each morning, the widow checked his fever with the back of her hand, her touch practiced, gentle. She had learned long ago how to tend wounds with almost nothing. Loss teaches that. So does poverty. The cowboy spoke little at first, saving strength, eyes tracking the room as if mapping exits even while lying still. When he did speak, it came in fragments. A question about the creek's depth, a comment on the wind shifting before rain. Small things, useful things. He knew land the way men only do after decades of owning it, or defending it. The widow noticed, but she didn't ask. On the frontier, questions could be dangerous. The children warmed to him in different ways. The eldest hovered near the door, protective, suspicious of any man who crossed their threshold. Hunger had sharpened his instincts early. The middle child watched with quiet fascination, hopeful eyes lingering on the cowboy's stories about distant trails and open plains. The youngest crept closer each day, placing a cup within reach, adjusting the blanket when she thought no one was looking. Resilience, the widow knew, wears many faces. In the evenings, when the fire burned low and the wind pressed against the walls, the widow finally spoke of her past. Not all at once. Never all of it. She spoke of a husband who never came home from a cattle drive, of land promised and then taken when papers vanished and stronger men stepped in, of learning to stretch meals and silence tears so the children could sleep. Her voice never shook. It didn't need to. Survival had sanded the edges smooth. The cowboy listened without interruption. When she finished, he nodded once, slow and respectful, as if acknowledging a debt. Hard country, he said. Hard people. There was weight behind the words, experience, not sympathy. When he shifted in pain, she caught a glimpse of a signet ring tucked on a cord beneath his shirt, quickly hidden again. A habit of wealth, disguised as caution. As his strength returned, so did his awareness. He helped from his bed at first, advising on fence repairs, suggesting where to set snares, pointing out a better route to town that avoided trouble. He never boasted, never claimed credit, but his authority slipped through in the way he spoke, the certainty that followed his suggestions. The widow noticed how the children listened, how even the eldest began to trust his guidance. A mystery settled among them like dust after a passing rider. Who was this man, really? Why travel alone with such knowledge and such silence? Why carry himself like someone used to being obeyed, yet accept scraps and a straw mattress without complaint? No one asked. Not yet. Bonds on the frontier weren't forged by confession, but by shared nights, shared labor, and the quiet understanding that everyone carried ghosts. As the cowboy slept more soundly and the children laughed a little louder, the widow sensed it. Whatever road had brought him to her door had not finished with him yet. Trouble came the way it always did on the frontier. Quiet at first, riding on familiarity. A pair of men showed up just after noon, their horses unhurried, their smiles practiced. They didn't look like violence. That was the trick of it. Violence announced itself. Men like these preferred to suggest. They leaned against the widow's fence as if it belonged to them. One thumb hooked into his belt, the other tapping ash from a cigar. He spoke of debts, old ones, poorly remembered, but somehow always growing. The other let his eyes wander over the cabin, the patched roof, the thin walls. He talked about claims, about land that had been misunderstood after her husband's death, about how accidents happened when paperwork wasn't settled. The widow stood her ground, spine straight, hands clenched at her sides. She'd heard this song before. So had her children. One of them drifted closer to the door without being told. Another stared at the dirt, jaw tight, already knowing how this ended more often than not. Inside the cabin, the wounded cowboy lay still, listening. Every word landed heavy. He heard the way they spoke her name, without respect, the way they spoke around the children, not to them. He heard the soft thread beneath every sentence. You are alone. You are easy. One of the men finally said it plain. If the widow couldn't settle what she owed, the land would be taken, the cabin emptied, the children sent elsewhere for their own good. It was spoken gently, like mercy. The widow refused. Her voice didn't shake, but it might have, if anyone was close enough to notice. The men left without pushing further. Not yet. They didn't need to. The warning had been delivered. Silence settled over the homestead like dust after a gunshot. That was when the cowboy understood the truth of it. This family wasn't just poor. They were exposed. And kindness, the kind they'd shown him, had painted a target on their door. Lying there, staring at the low rafters, he faced a question sharper than his pain. If he revealed who he was, what he owned, would it protect them? Or would it draw something worse down on a family already standing at the edge? Out here, power could save you, or it could get you killed. The widow didn't wait for another knock at the door. She'd learned too much about the frontier to believe danger announced itself twice. At dawn, she put the children to work with quiet urgency, patching gaps in the cabin walls with scrap wood and old canvas, moving sacks of grain into the crawl space beneath the floor, hiding what little they owned as if scarcity itself could be stolen. The air smelled of dust and fear, but also of resolve. This was how poor families survived, not by winning, but by enduring. The children worked differently, each shaped by hardship. One watched the horizon while hammering, eyes sharp for riders. Another carried water back and forth, careful not to spill a drop. The youngest gathered stones and stacked them by the door without being asked, small hands trembling in the cold. No one spoke much. Words wasted energy. The land understood actions better anyway. The cowboy joined in without ceremony. His wound still pained him, but he moved with a certainty that caught the widow's eye. He showed them how to brace the door from the inside using a fallen beam, how to set the lantern low so light wouldn't bleed through the windows at night. He adjusted sight lines from the cabin's single window, clearing brush in a way that suggested long familiarity with violence. It wasn't just skill, it was instinct. The kind earned over years, not picked up in passing. The widow noticed, but she didn't ask. Out here, questions could wait if the work was good. Still, something shifted. This man who'd arrived broken and bleeding now carried himself like someone who'd once given orders and expected them to be followed. The children noticed too. They listened when he spoke. They copied how he held a tool, how he scanned the land before turning his back. Trust grew not from promises, but from competence. By evening, they gathered around the table. Supper was thin, but shared. The widow tore bread into even pieces, the cowboy insisting on the smallest without comment. A child laughed at something small, nothing worth remembering anywhere else, but here it sounded like hope. The lantern flickered. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls as if testing them. In that quiet, something formed that none of them named. Not charity, not debt. Family, maybe, but not the kind written down. The kind built plank by plank, meal by meal, through shared fear and shared effort. They had little, but they stood together. And on the frontier, that was sometimes enough. The riders came at first light, hooves tearing the frozen ground like they meant to rip the land itself apart. Dust lifted in a brown veil, and beneath it rode the men who'd been circling the widow's life for months. Hard eyes, harder smiles, coats cut from other people's suffering. They didn't knock. They never did. They fanned out around the cabin with the practiced ease of men used to taking what couldn't fight back. Inside, the children went still. One reached for the widow's skirt. Another pressed a shaking palm to the window and pulled it back, breath fogging the glass. The widow felt the weight of every empty cupboard, every broken hinge. Every night she'd prayed the world might pass her by. It hadn't. It had come armed. A voice carried from outside, smooth and oily. "Time's up," it said. "We warned you." A boot struck the porch rail. Wood cracked. The threat wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. These men had learned that quiet fear traveled farther. The widow stepped forward anyway, heart pounding, hands open. "There's nothing left," she said. "You've taken." A rifle but slammed into the post beside her, splintering it. The children cried out. The men laughed. This was how it always went. Pressure until the weak folded, until mercy felt foolish. Then the cowboy stood. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if time belonged to him again. The pain that had been him days ago was gone, replaced by something colder and steadier. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stepped past the widow and onto the porch, boots planted, shoulders squared. The men hesitated, not because of fear, but because something in his posture didn't fit the story they'd told themselves. "Back off," the lead rider said, amused. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The cowboy met his eyes. "I do." That was when the land itself seemed to listen. He spoke names, quietly, accurately. He named the foreman who'd skimmed payroll, the deputy who'd sold warnings for coin, the partner who'd signed papers he didn't understand. Each name landed like a stone dropped into water, widening circles of silence. The men shifted. One glanced back toward the road, calculating distance. Another swallowed. The cowboy took a step forward. "You rode past 3 boundary markers you don't own," he said. "You crossed a line you were paid to respect, and you threatened a family under my protection." The lead rider scoffed, but it rang hollow. "Your protection?" The cowboy's hand lifted, not to draw, but to signal. From the ridge came the sound of hooves. Not a charge, a presence. Riders crested the hill and stopped, spaced wide, rifles easy in their saddles. Not hired muscle, men who knew the land, who'd worked it, who'd been paid fair and remembered it. The air changed. Confidence bled out of the circle like water through a crack. "I was left for dead," the cowboy said, voice even. "Mistake." He let the words settle. "My name carries weight you don't want to test. I own the range that feeds your horses, and the wells you drink from when no one's watching. And I'm done letting you hunt the poor because it's convenient." A rifle cracked. The shot tore a plank from the porch, inches from his shoulder. The children screamed. The widow grabbed them and dragged them low. The cowboy didn't flinch. He didn't need to. The answering shots came sharp and clean from the ridge, warning fire that chewed dirt at the rider's feet. Horses reared. Men swore. The neat little circle collapsed into chaos. "Hold," the cowboy called, and the word carried authority like a badge. The firing stopped. Smoke drifted. Somewhere, a horse snorted and settled. The lead rider's face had gone pale. "You can't." "I can," the cowboy said. "And I am." He stepped down into the dust, closing the distance. "You leave now. You don't come back. You don't send someone braver or stupider. If you do, I won't be this patient." Silence pressed in. Then spurs turned. One by one, the riders backed away, pride swallowed by survival. The last to go looked at the widow, not with hunger this time, but with calculation. He'd lost. He knew it. When the dust finally settled, the widow realized her hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the sudden release of it. The children stared at the man who'd nearly died in their beds, and now stood like the land had risen to protect them. The cowboy turned back to the porch, his gaze softer now. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The widow shook her head. "No." He nodded once. Outside, the ridge riders peeled away, work done. Inside, the cabin felt bigger than it ever had. Power had shown its face, not loud, not cruel, but firm enough to draw a line and mean it. The dust settled the way it always does after violence, slowly, reluctantly, as if the land itself needed time to accept what had happened. The men who came to take from the widow left empty-handed. Some rode away nursing wounds. Others stayed behind, stripped of authority by papers and witnesses they never expected the dying cowboy to carry in his coat. Power, once revealed, collapsed their cruelty like a rotten beam. Morning came soft. A pale dawn stretched across the hills, and with it came rain, light at first, then steady. It washed blood from the dirt and soot from the cabin walls. The widow stood in the doorway with her children pressed close, watching the land drink it in. For the first time since her husband died, the fear loosened its grip. The threats were gone. The dead men would not return. The ground beneath her feet was finally hers again. The cowboy moved carefully now, still healing, but different. Lighter. He spoke plainly, without ceremony, offering protection not as charity, but as justice long overdue. Land restored. Work guaranteed. A future that didn't hinge on luck alone. The children listened wide-eyed, unsure how a life could change so completely overnight. When the rain eased, rebuilding began. Boards were reset. Fences straightened. Laughter, hesitant at first, found its way back into the yard. The cabin, once a place of waiting, became a place of planning. That evening, as firelight warmed the room, the cowboy finally said what mattered. He told the widow the truth. He lived because she chose mercy when she had nothing to spare. And in saving him, she gave him something wealth never had, a family that didn't need his name to matter. Outside, the rain stopped. The land breathed. And a future, once impossible, took root where kindness had dared to stand. Out on the frontier, justice didn't always come from judges or guns. More often, it rose from the dirt floors of poor cabins, from hands that had nothing left to give, yet gave anyway. Compassion out here was a gamble, and those with the least were often the ones who risked the most. That widow could have turned away. Her children were hungry. Her roof barely held. Helping a dying stranger could have cost them everything. But she chose mercy anyway. And the frontier, harsh as it was, remembered that choice. So let me ask you this. As the dust settles and the night grows quiet, what would you have done? When survival told you to walk on, would you have listened? Or would you have stopped, knelt down, and trusted that kindness might one day return? If this story stayed with you, leave your thoughts here, where stories are shared like warmth in the dark. And if you want to keep walking these long frontier roads with us, through tales of justice earned the hard way, then subscribe, and stay close to the fire. The cabin stands stronger now. Laughter replaces fear, and a family that once had nothing has everything it needs. Proof that mercy, when given freely, can change destinies forever.